Hey there. Viewers, have you ever seen someone who thought they were untouchable finally face reality? How did it change the way you saw them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Today's story takes us inside the courtroom where the judge said something to Diddy that left him in tears, and you won't believe what it was. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Man. I was never one to keep up with celebrity drama. The tabloids, the scandals, the endless speculation, it all seemed like noise to me, but when you work the kind of job I do, sometimes that noise turns into something real. Something you can't ignore. That night, I was at MDC Brooklyn, like I always was. Same shift, same faces, same concrete walls, pressing in from every direction. Nothing about. The place changed except maybe the people inside it. The new ones always came in looking tough, talking big, puffing out their chests. A few weeks in that bravado would start to wear off a month later. They'd blend in with the rest. Just another ghost in a sea of forgotten men. Diddy wasn't blending in, though not even close. The first time I saw him in here, I figured he'd play the game. Like the rest of them, keep his head down. Lay low, wait for the lawyers to work their magic. But that's not how it went. He was still clinging to that aura, that feeling of being untouchable. Like he was just waiting for the mistake to be corrected, like any minute now. Someone was going to come in, shake his hand, tell him it was all a big misunderstanding, and let him walk out the front door. But that wasn't going to happen. And I think he knew that. Deep down that night, something changed. It started with the whispers. Not from the inmates, no. They didn't know a thing. It was the officer. ERS, the ones who'd been in the game long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The ones who'd seen high-profile guys come and go and knew how the system really worked. There were murmurs of an unannounced court date, something that hadn't been scheduled, something that wasn't on any official record. That alone wasn't unheard of. Some cases moved quietly behind closed doors, but this was different. This wasn't just some procedural thing. This was secret. I was standing near the control desk when the order came through. Diddy's being moved now? No explanation. No paperwork beyond the basics, just a direct command passed down from somewhere above, and a few of us were expected to carry it out. I wasn't part of the transport team, but I saw it happen. 2 officers walked straight to his cell, didn't say a word. He looked up like he was expecting them, or maybe dreading them. He was dressed already, like he knew they were coming. That was the first sign something was off. Most inmates, even the high-profile ones, would fight for information, demand to know where they were going, who ordered it, what the next step was. But did he? Didn't ask a single question. He just stood up and walked out. No cuffs, no chains, they'd never seen that before. The few prisoners still awake. At that hour, stopped talking. A couple of them shifted closer to their doors, trying to get a look. Nobody said a word, though. Nobody called out to him. It was like they were watching a ghost walk past the officers, escorted him down the corridor past the rows of cells, past the heavy steel doors that led to the secured exit as he disappeared from view. I turned to one of the senior guards. Guy had been working the system for nearly 20 years. "What the hell is this?" I asked. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the empty hallway where Diddy had just been. Something big, that was all he said. I went back to my post, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was happening. Something that wasn't meant to be public. The thing about MDC Brooklyn is that it's a machine. Everything runs in a schedule down to the minute, meals, lights out, count checks, everything. If someone is getting moved, it's on a roster. If someone is going to court, it's on a calendar. But this wasn't anywhere. I checked every database I had access to. There was no record of Diddy's transport, no upcoming court date attached to his name, no internal memos explaining where he'd been taken or when he was expected back. It was like he had just vanished. That doesn't happen. Not with a guy like him. Not with a case like his. I thought about the rumors that had been swirling around for months. The names coming forward. The witnesses flipping the sealed documents that no one was supposed to see it was building up to something. That much was clear, and then I thought about why they would need to pull him out in the dead of night, without warning, without paperwork. This wasn't a routine hearing. This wasn't about court procedure. This was something else. Hours passed. Morning came by then. People had started noticing he was gone. The inmates who usually orbited around him, whether out of respect, fear, or just curiosity, were. Whispering, a few even asked the guards straight up, "Where's Puff?" No answers by. Soon I started hearing murmurs from the staff. Someone had seen him being brought back. Not through the usual channels, not through the main processing area, but through a side entrance that meant two things. One, he had been brought back, quietly, with no intention of making his return public. And two, whatever happened in that room, it wasn't for the public to know. By the time I saw him again, he looked different. It was subtle, but it was there, the way he carried himself, the way he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes that wasn't the Diddy who'd walked out of here last night. Something had happened, something that had shaken him. I didn't know what was said in that room. I didn't know who had been in there, or what was laid out in front of him. But I did know one thing, that he wasn't untouchable anymore. And whatever had gone down behind those closed doors, it had broken something in him. Chapter 2. The judge's private chamber. The cold fluorescent lights above hummed faintly as Shaw Combs led through the Titan-marked corridors of the courthouse. The usual bravado that once defined him had worn thin, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, a weight settling in his chest that refused to lift the walk from the transport van to the courtroom should have felt familiar by now. Yet nothing about this night was routine. It wasn't the usual courtroom with cameras flashing, reporters fighting for sound bites, and his legal team by his side. No grand entrances, no suits, no carefully planned public statements. Instead, he was walked through a back entrance, escorted down a hallway where the walls seemed to close in the farther he went. The air was thick with something unspoken, the kind of tension that couldn't be seen, but was suffocating all the same. The moment. He stepped into the room. He knew this was not a normal proceeding. The chamber was small, windowless, built for discretion. Not spectac, in the center sat a single polished oak table lined with stacks of folders, their edges worn from too many, hands flipping through them. The judge, a man who had likely sentenced thousands in his time, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up. When Diddy entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. There were no journalists. Here, no flashing cameras to document this moment. No public gallery filled with familiar faces to two U.S. Marshals stood silently behind the judge. Their presence an unspoken message that whatever was about to take place was non-negotiable across the table. 3 men in dark suits sat without a word. They weren't prosecutors, that much was obvious. Their posture was too stiff, their expressions too cold. These weren't people looking for a conviction. They were here for something else, something heavier than just a legal battle. Diddy's throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. "Where's my lawyer?" His voice, once smooth and commanding, now had an edge of strain to it. The judge finally looked up. His face was lined, hardened by years of sentencing. Men who thought they were bigger than the law. His voice, when it came, was steady, detached. "Mr. Combs," he said, "do you know why you're here?" He hesitated. He had spent months preparing for legal warfare, gearing up for trial, for media battles, for aggressive courtroom defenses. He was ready for grandstanding, for spectacle. But this wasn't a stage. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This was something entirely different, and the realization of that hit him like a brick to the chest. "I don't understand," he said, forcing himself to keep his voice. Even one of the men across the table, the one who hadn't spoken, yet reached for the folders in front of him and flicked one open, slow and deliberate. Diddy's eyes flicked to the pages inside, and his stomach lurched. He recognized some of the documents immediately. He had seen them before. Sealed court files, financial records, lists of names. His lawyers had fought to keep these out of the trial. They were supposed to be buried. Yet here they were laid out, before for him like an open grave. The judge folded his hands in front of him, his expression unreadable. Your legal team has done an admirable job keeping certain pieces of evidence away from the public eye. But you see, Mr. Combems, there are proceedings that take place outside of public scrutiny proceedings, where the rules work a little differently. He glanced toward the men in suits as if giving them silent permission to proceed. One of them leaned forward, tying his fingers against the folder. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Diddy stayed silent. The man flipped to another page and pushed it forward, sliding the document across the table until it sat directly in front of. Diddy didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. His eyes were already locked on, the name printed at the top. The unmistakable black ink standing out against the crisp white paper. His stomach knotted, his pulse thawing in his ears. This wasn't just some low-level industry figure trying to save themselves. This wasn't a disgruntled ex-employee or a former friend turned opportunist. This was someone inside the circle. Someone who had never spoken a word out of turn. Someone who had seen everything and had been untouchable. Until now. His mind raced. Had they flipped? Had they been forced? Had they been caught doing something worse and turned over information in exchange for protection? Protection. Diddy's fingers curled into fists under the table, his jaw tightening. He knew the rules of this world better than anyone. If someone inside had turned, it meant the entire structure was crumbling. It meant that every deal made in the shadows, every unspoken agreement, every whispered threat had stopped holding weight. The judge let the silence stretch before speaking again. "This individual has provided us with extensive information." Mr. Colmes, some of it highly detailed. One of the suited men picked up another document, flipping it open. Transactions. He said simply, "Financial records, dates, locations, communications." He paused, then turned to another section, tapping the page lightly with his index finger. And then there, Diddy's eyes flicked. Down his breath hitched a signed Kant. Kant racked his name. And below it, another name, one that should have never been attached to anything in writing. His body tensed, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. A bad poker face could cost everything. In a room like this wasn't meant to exist. Was it? The man in the suit wasn't asking. He already knew the answer. Yet, here it is. Diddy sat motionless, his mind moving at 100 m an hour. He had cleaners for this, people who handled exactly this kind of situation. They were supposed to ensure there were no loose ends, no paper trails, no recordings, nothing that could ever come back to him. But somehow someone had missed something, or worse, someone had kept something, and now it was sitting right in front of him. The judge's voice cut through the room, again. Calm, but firm. "We are past the stage of denials. Mr. Colmes, you're not here to argue innocence or guilt. You're here because we have evidence and because the people you once relied on no longer feel the need to protect you." Diddy forced his breathing to stay even. He was still assessing, still searching for an opening, a weak spot. These men, the ones in the suits, they weren't regular prosecutors. They weren't looking for a trial. This was something else. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want?" The suited man closest to him leaned back slightly in his chair, watching him for a moment before answering. "We want cooperation." Diddy nearly laughed, but the sound never left his throat. "You want me to roll over?" he muttered. The judge didn't blink. "We want the truth." Diddy scoffed, shifting slightly in his seat. "The truth," he repeated. "Or the story you want." One of the U.S. Marshals behind him shifted slightly, the leather of his belt creaking. It was a reminder, a warning. This wasn't a negotiation. The man in the suit tapped the folder again. "You misunderstand, Mr. Combs. This isn't about what we want. It's about what we already have." Diddy stared at him, and then the suited man gestured toward the wall. Diddy turned his head, slightly following the movement, and then his stomach dropped, a door nearly invisible against. The paneling clicked softly as it opened. A second later, a flat-screen television was wheeled in by another man in a suit, this one wearing an expression so unreadable it sent an instinctual primolunius through him. The judge sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Before we continue," he said, "I think you need to see something." The suited man grabbed our remote and pressed a button. The screen flickered. To life for the first time that night, Diddy felt a real, undeniable chill run down his spine. There was no audio at first, just a grainy image shifting slightly as the camera struggled to focus a dimly lit hallway, a door, a woman standing there, glancing around before she stepped. Inside, Diddy's mouth went dry. He knew this footage, or rather he knew what it was supposed to be. There wasn't supposed to be a recording of this. He forced himself to keep watching as the footage shifted. The door opened again. More people entered, some of them recognizable, some of them not. And then, the moment he'd been dreading, his own figure appeared on the screen. Diddy's heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his fingers digging into the armrest of his chair before he even realized he was gripping. That someone had recorded it. Someone had kept it, and now it was in their hands. The suited man pressed pause. The room stayed silent. Diddy forced himself to look away from the screen, his vision blurry with something he refused to name. The judge leaned forward, his voice just as calm as before. "Do you know how much of this there is?" he asked. Diddy clenched his jaw. The suited man placed the remote on the table and folded his hands. "This is the part where you decide. If you want to spend the rest of your life in a cage," he said. Diddy exhaled slowly. He could feel the shift in the room now, the way everything was closing in, because for the first time in his life, he had no control. Chapter 3. The name that changed everything. Diddy sat, frozen, staring at the stack of files in front of him. His breath shallow, and measured. The air in the room had shifted. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was something darker, something final. There was no courtroom audience, no media, circus, no carefully crafted statements from his legal team. Just this room, these men, and the weight of what had just been. Said he hadn't reacted when they read the first name, not outwardly, but inside. Something cracked. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a victim. It wasn't some desperate ex-associate trying to shave years off their own sentence. It was one of his own. The judge continued reading from the files in that same calm, deliberate voice, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. More names followed, each one another knife twisting in his gut. Diddy had built his empire on loyalty, on the unspoken rules that had kept him insulated for decades. But now, that insulation was gone. A former bodyguard, the longtime business partner, a woman who had attended his most exclusive, most secretive parties, a financial insider. The one person who knew where the money went, where it came from, who it was funneled through. Diddy clenched his fists under the table, willing himself not to move, not to react. He needed to think, to assess, to find a way out. There had to be a way out. But the list didn't stop. More names, more betrayals. Each one more unthinkable than the last. These weren't people who could be dismissed as opportunists or liars. These were people who had been in the room, people who had helped him, people who had been part of the machine, and now they had turned against him. The judge flipped a page as if he'd all the time in the world. These individuals have provided us with first-hand accounts. Mr. Combs, not rumors, not speckle, not hearsay. He let the words sink in before continuing. They provided us with records, financial logs, internal communications, flight manifests, hotel registrations, deposits. He glanced up, making sure Diddy was still with him. And of course, there's the footage. Diddy's breath hitched the footage. The words echoed in his mind, rattling against the inside of his skull like gunshots for years. He had been careful. Every room was swept. Every phone confiscated. Every risk eliminated before it could take root. He had trusted only the right people, the ones who knew the stakes, the ones who had just as much to lose. Yet somehow they had it. The judge didn't need to elaborate. The damage was already done. Diddy's mind raced, grasping it. Possibilities, could they be bluffing? Could they have doctored something he'd seen his share of smear campaign, had dealt with lawsuits and accusations before he knew how easy it was to manipulate the truth. But something in the judge's eyes told him this wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a legal battle to be fought in a courtroom. This was a slow, systematic dismantling of everything he'd built. The silence stretched thick and unbearable before Diddy finally forced himself to speak. His voice, once smooth and commanding, came out tight-edged with something close to desperation. Who? The judge raised an eyebrow. Who what? Diddy's jaw tightened. He hated this powerless, caged feeling creeping in the realization that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Who gave you the tapes? The judge set the file down, folded his hands. That doesn't matter, Mr. Combs. But it did. It mattered more than anything. Because whoever had done this was still out there. Diddy had seen people turn before people who cracked. Under pressure, people who ran their mouths when the heat got too intense. He knew how to handle that. He knew what to expect. But this was different. These weren't... Nobody's looking for a plea deal. These were his inner circle. And if they had flipped, it meant the entire foundation was gone. The silence stretched again. The men in suits didn't shift, didn't fidget. They had all the time in the world. They had already won. Diddy exhaled slowly through his nose, trying to keep his mind clear. What do you want? He asked again, his voice quieter. This time the judge exchanged a glance with the men across from him, as if deciding how much to give away. Then he leaned forward just slightly, his expression still unreadable. Cooper Diddy almost laughed. Almost. You think I'm just going to start talking? One of the men in suits, the one who had been flipping through the files, spoke. For the first time, you don't have a choice. Diddy's shoulders stiffened. You seem to think you're still negotiating. The man continued, flipping another page, without even looking up. That this is just another lawsuit, another media scandal. It's not. He turned another page, stopped, and tapped a paragraph with his index finger. This is about the truth. Mr. Combs, the truth. Your own people are telling us. Diddy shook his head. They don't have anything. The man smirked just slightly, don't they? Then he reached into the file, pulled out a printed photograph, and placed it on the table in front of Diddy. Diddy's stomach lurched. It was grainy, a still from security, print footage, a familiar hallway, a familiar door, a familiar face, his own. He swallowed hard, keeping his expression blank. He had been in hundreds of hotels, had walked down thousands of hallways. This meant nothing. Then the man pulled out another photo. This one wasn't grainy. It wasn't a security camera. Still, it was a close-up, a room, a setting. He knew all too well. And then the real gut punch. Another name printed neatly below the image. Bold, undeniable. Diddy's breath caught in his throat. His fingers twitched against his palm. It wasn't just a name. It was a signature. A signature that shouldn't exist. A signature that meant whoever this was, they had been keeping records. They had been holding on to things. They had never been loyal. The realizations sent a chill down his spine. Diddy clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He wanted to lash out, wanted to shove the files off the table, wanted to yell, to do something. But he couldn't, because for the first time in his life he had no idea who he could trust. The judge sat back, watching him carefully. This is your reality now, Mr. Combs. He said your people have made their choice, now it's time for you to make yours. Diddy said nothing because deep down he knew there was no way out of this chapter 4. The footage that could end him. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The judge hadn't spoken. The men in suits hadn't moved. Diddy, say stone-face, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He had spent years mastering the art of control, keeping his expression unreadable, even in the worst situations. But this was different. One of the men in suits gave a nod. The door at the far end of the chamber creaked open, and a cart was wheeled inside. On top sat an old television, the kind with a bulky baz. Nothing sleek or modern. There was no keyboard, no external hard drive, no cables suggesting an internet connection. This wasn't something pulled from the cloud. No digitally altered compilation of share-picked clips. No, this was real. The kind of real that couldn't be manipulated. The remote was placed on the table. No one touched it yet. The screen was black, a void, waiting to swallow him whole. Diddy exhaled slow and controlled, refusing to show the unease rising in his chest. He had been here before, in rooms where his name was whispered, where accusations threatened to bubble to the surface. He had seen threats extinguished before. They could spark into flames. He had survived, but this time felt different. The judge finally spoke, his voice devoid of anything close to sympathy. "You are going to watch this, Mr. Combs, all of it." He gestured toward the screen. "And by the end of it, you are going to tell us if you still believe there's a way out of this." Diddy didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The man across from him pressed the power button on the remote. The screen flickered, static, humming for half a second before the picture settled. A hotel hallway. Diddy recognized it instantly. One of the penthouse floors of a luxury hotel in Miami. The walls were sleek, the lighting dim, the carpeting pristine. The timestamp in the bottom corner read 3:12 a.m. The footage was grainy, taken from a discreet ComPA-L placed camera, maybe a hotel security feed. A door opened. A woman stepped out, looking over her shoulder before she disappeared down the hall. Then another figure emerged. He felt his jaw clench, watching himself move through the frame. He was adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. His posture relaxed, completely unaware that every movement was being recorded. Then, just as he turned the corner, the screen cut to another angle. Angle, this one, was different. No longer grainy, no longer distant. This wasn't hotel security footage. This was someone inside the room. The camera shook slightly, as if the person holding it was steadying their grip. The lighting was dim, but there was no mistaking the interior of one of his private party suites. The kind of place where phones were confiscated at the door, where trust was a requirement, where no one was supposed to be recording Diddy's stomach. Twisted, the footage played on a small group of high-profile figures lounged in the background, laughing. Drinking, the camera panned, catching glimpses of faces, some blurred, some not. Some of the most powerful men in the industry. Then the conversation started. It wasn't loud. No raised voices. No aggression. Just low, careful words exchanged between men who thought they were safe. "Everyone here understands the rules," his own voice said. From the screen, it wasn't a question, a murmur of agreement. Someone off camera chuckled, another voice. One he recognized spoke up. "You think someone would be dumb enough to talk Diddy's voice again? Firm if they do. They don't talk again." His blood ran cold. The footage continued. It wasn't about money or drugs. It wasn't about wild parties or the things the tabloids had already speculated about for years. This was coercion, the kind of thing that turned whispers into headlines, the kind of thing that transformed lawsuits into federal cases. Then the worst part came. The screen cut to a new clip. The angle was closer, the lighting softer, but there was no mistaking what was happening. The room was silent. The camera, whoever was holding it, had captured something he never expected to be reported. Diddy didn't move. Didn't. Brea, a minute passed, then another. No one spoke. Finally, the judge reached for the remote and pressed pause. The screen froze, locking that moment in time, making it undeniable. Pi felt the blood drain from his face. The judge leaned back in his chair, watching him carefully. "We don't need to explain to you what this means, do we?" Diddy opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He forced himself to swallow to push down the rising panic to try and think who had recorded this. How had they kept it? Why had it surfaced now? You seem to think this is just about you, the judge continued. But you're missing the bigger picture. He gestured toward the screen again. You recognize them, don't you, Did? He knew exactly who was on that tape. He had built his empire alongside them, had spent decades solidifying, relationships ensuring loyalty, making sure that everyone who entered his world understood the rules. But now those same people were evidence, and they would do anything to make sure they weren't the ones going down. The judge's voice cut through his thoughts. This is no longer about money, no longer about settlements. This is a federal matter, and you know exactly what that means. Diddy forced his hands to remain still to stop them, from gripping the table, from betraying the storm. Raging inside of him, he had bought his way out of trouble before, had called in favors, had relied on the weight of his name, his influence. But this wasn't just a scandal. This was a collapse, and for the first time he realized there was no way out. Chapter 5. The judge's words that broke him. The silence that followed was suffocating. The screen had gone black, but the images still burned behind Diddy's eyes. His mind raced desperately, searching for an explanation, an escape, something he could grasp onto to pull himself out of this. But there was nothing. No misinterpretation. No angle to twist this into something salvageable. The room was thick with anticipation, but the weight of what he had just seen made it impossible for him to speak. The judge sat still, watching him, allowing the moment to sink in, allowing him to feel every second of it. Then finally, the voice that had already shattered so much spoke again. Mr. Combs, this is only the beginning. Diddy felt his throat tighten. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. He had been in tight corners before, had maneuvered out of impossible situations. But this was something different. There was no stage, no cameras, no carefully selected words that could sway public perception. There was only evidence, damning and irrefutable. The men in suits had yet to move, their expressions as still and unyielding as ever. He wanted to fight, to deny, to demand his lawyers be brought in, but his voice was dry. His mouth felt like sandpaper. He had seen enough. The judge exhaled, picking up a fresh stack of papers, flipping through them casually before setting them down. In front of him, let's get to the reality of your situation. He said, his voice level but firm. You've spent decades insulating yourself, making sure the dirt never touched you directly. You surrounded yourself with loyalists, ensured that none who knew the full picture ever lived to tell the story. He tapped the top sheet of the stack. That's over now. Diddy's stomach churned. The judge continued. You have racketeering. You have sex trafficking. You have obstruction of justice. But you are already new. Those? His voice remained steady, impersonal, as if he were reading off a grocery list. Now we have new testimonies. People who have been part of your operation for years. Years, who are ready to stand in front of a jury and explain exactly how it worked. They've provided documentation, text messages, emails, financial transactions that link directly to you. He leaned back slightly, watching for a reaction. What that means is simple. You're facing a potential life sentence. The words hit him like a gunshot. It wasn't supposed to go this far. He had paid people off, silenced those who threatened him, ensured that no one would ever be able to piece together the full story. But here they were, spelling it out, presenting it to him piece by piece. He felt the sweat on the back of his neck, cold and unwelcome. He could hear his own breathing, too loud in the quiet room. And then the judge's voice changed. It was no longer just cold, no longer just calculated. It was something worse, final, and you won't be alone. Diddy's breath caught in his throat. The judge picked up another document, flipping it open. His eyes skimmed over. The page Then he placed it flat on the table. We've been watching the names surrounding you for a long time, but until now we've never had a reason to move on them. He slid the paper forward, the name at the top printed in bold, that changed when they started talking. Diddy's fingers twitched at his sides, but he kept them. Under the table, his expression carefully blank. His heart was racing, but he couldn't let them see it. The judge wasn't finished. He slid another file forward, then another 3. Names. Diddy's stomach sank. These weren't just associates. They weren't disposable people he could afford to lose. These were people he thought were untouchable. His mind reeled, running through every possibility, every potential informant, every conversation over the years. These were men who had built careers alongside him, who had helped him expand his empire, who had benefited from the same secrecy he had. The judge let the silence stretch for a moment, then spoke again. "Sealed indictments," he said. For now, Dai's eyes flicked toward the documents, but he didn't move to touch them. He could already guess what they contained. Evidence statements, maybe even recordings. But the worst part wasn't what was inside them. It was what they meant. The walls weren't just closing in on him. They were closing in on everyone. The judge leaned forward. "Slightly, do you understand what I'm telling you?" Diddy forced himself to breathe evenly. He knew better than to speak. Too soon knew better than to give them anything before he had fully assessed his position. But there was no way to assess this. No amount of money. No back row deals. No favors could undo what had already been said. In motion, the judge continued. "You built an empire on the belief that you were untouchable, that the people around you would always protect you. That fear and power would keep them in line." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Diddy's. "But power only lasts as long as the fear does, and right now they fear prison more than they fear you." Diddy swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had prepared for everything: lawsuits, scandals, bad press, but not this. Not the people closest to him folding under pressure. Not people who had spent decades in his inner circle choosing to turn over everything, rather than go down with him. The judge let the words settle. Then, tapped the files once more. "There's one simple reason we're sitting in this room, Mr. Combs." He gestured toward the sealed indictments. "Right now, you are our priority, but that can change." He leaned back, watching him closely. "If you want to keep them out of this, you need to start talking." Diddy's stomach twisted. The judge folded his hands in front of him. "You have a choice. You can spend the rest of your life behind bars fighting this case until you run out of appeals, watching as the people around you do the same." He glanced toward the television screen, still frozen on that damning final frame. "Or you can cooperate." He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them led to an outcome he could live with. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one with the power. But here in this room, he was just another defendant waiting to hear his fate. And for the first time, he truly understood. This was bigger than him. This was the end chapter. 6. A deal. He couldn't, except the judge. Let the words settle, watching him closely. There was an urgency in his voice. No impatience, they had already won. This was just a formality, now a ritual before the execution. Diddy could feel it. The men in suits weren't here to negotiate. They were here to collect. The final card had been placed on the table, and the air in the room shifted with the weight of it. The words hung there heavy and immovable. Testimony, that was what they wanted. Not an admission of guilt. Not a public confession profession. They wanted names. The kind of names that could collapse industries. The kind of names that, if spoken in the wrong place, could get Ammon killed before he even stepped into a prison cell. Diddy's fingers curled against the table, his knuckles going white. He didn't look at the judge, didn't react right away. His mind was spinning, too fast, running through every scenario, every outcome, every possible out. A deal, that's what they were calling it, but it wasn't. An offer. It was a loaded gun handed to him with the expectation that he'd know exactly where to aim. They were giving him a choice: destroy yourself or destroy everyone around you. The judge's voice remained steady. If you cooperate. Mr. Combs, you won't be walking free. You know that? But what we're offering you is a future, a reduced sentence you wouldn't have to spend the rest of your life behind bars. He folded his hands together. You'd still have time left. He almost laughed, but the sound wouldn't come time, as if time was something he could bargain for now, as if time meant anything when he knew what happened. People who took deals like this, he had seen it before. He had watched people in this industry, in this world, disappear after turning informant. Sometimes it was quiet, an overdose, a sudden accident, a body found floating in the wrong part of town. Other times it was loud, humiliating, a man stripped of everything he built, reduced to nothing, left to rot in the corners of history. A warning to the next one who thought they could betray the system. Diddy had spent his entire life making sure he wasn't one of those people, and now they wanted him to become one. He forced himself to meet the judge's gate. His throat was dry, but he pushed the words out anyway. Who do? You think I am? His voice was quieter than he expected, but it carried you. Think I'm just going to start talking. One of the men in suits smirked, shaking his head slightly. Mr. Combs, we don't think you're going to talk. He leaned forward. We know you will. Did. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears. The man continued. The people who've come forward again against you, they're not street guys. They're not the kind of people who handle their own problems. He tilted his head. But the people you're protecting, they are. Diddy swallowed hard. You've spent your life sitting in the middle, the man said, managing, controlling, making sure the people above you never got touched and the people below you never got too powerful. He tapped the file in front of him. But now those people above you, they're watching. His smirk widen slightly, and they're waiting to see if you're going to be a problem. Diddy didn't move. The judge spoke again, his tone. Even do you understand what's happening here? Mr. Combs. Diddy exhaled slowly through his nose. Yeah, he said, finally, I understand. He understood exactly what this was. They weren't just offering him a deal. They were giving him a death sentence the moment he opened his mouth. It wouldn't matter if he got a reduced sentence. It wouldn't matter if he served 1 year or 20. It wouldn't matter if he walked out of prison in 5 years or 5 months, because the second he flipped, the second he gave them anything, he was a dead man. Walking, the judge studied him, reading the way his muscles tensed, the way his fingers dug slightly into the table. Then he nodded slowly, as if he already knew what was coming. I understand this is a difficult decision, he said, but I want you to consider something. He gestured toward the sealed indictment still sitting untouched on the table. The men you're protecting, they don't care about you, Mr. Combs. If they did, you wouldn't be sitting here. They would have protected you. Diddy felt something in his chest tighten. The judge leaned forward slightly. They won't be making deals to save you. He let that sink in before he added, they'll be making them to bury you. Something cracked inside him for the first time since this nightmare had started. Something inside him broke. His jaw clenched, his vision blurring slightly at the edges. He knew it was true. He knew deep down that they Theonis, he had spent years shielding, defending, making sure they never got too close to the flames, wouldn't do the same for him. They would let him burn. Diddy sucked in a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to hold it. His hands were shaking now, just slightly, but he kept them on the table, gripping. The edge so tight his knuckles ached. His whole body felt tight like a live wire ready to snap. And then, before he could stop it, before he could shove it down, bury it deep, keep it locked away, his vision blurred, his throat closed up, and the pressure in his chest became too much for the first time in front of these men. In this silent, suffocating room, Diddy broke down. His head dropped slightly, his shoulders locking his breath, hitching in his throat. He wasn't sobbing, he wasn't making a sound, but he didn't need to. The sheer act of losing control, even for a second, was enough. The judge didn't look. Surprised, the men in suits didn't flinch. They had seen this before. They had seen what happened when a man realized in real time that he had no way out. They let the silence stretch for a long time before the judge finally spoke again. His voice softer now, but no less. Deadly. Take some time. Mr. Combs, he said, we'll be back soon to hear your answer. Then, without another word, they stood. Diddy didn't lift his head as the judge walked out, followed by the men in suits. She heard the door click shut behind them, heard the muffled voices of the U.S. Marshals outside, but he didn't move because he knew. He knew they already had their answer, and so did he. Chapter 7. The moment. Everything fell apart. The silence in the room was like a weight pressing down on Diddy's chest. He could feel it constricting, his breathing tightening his throat, squeezing the last traces of composure from his body. His hands, which had been gripping the edges of the chair for what felt like hours, finally released, leaving deep indentations in his palms. His whole body was tense, his mind a mess of static and fragmented thoughts. His vision was blurred, his pulse hammering so loudly in his ears that it drowned out the faint sound of movement in the corridor beyond the chamber doors. The judge and the men in suits had left, giving him time as if time would change anything. He had spent his life controlling the narrative, controlling everything. But in that moment, he realized just how little power he had left. He had built an empire on perception, on whispers, in back rooms, on knowing who to call, who to silence, who to keep close. Now all of it was meaningless. The people he had protected had flipped the money he had used. Tubery Problems was worthless. The name he had built into a brand. A dynasty was now just another headline. In a case that was too big to make disappear, he was trapped, and they knew it. The door creaked open again. The judge re-entered first, walking with the same deliberate, steady pace. His expression unreadable. The men in suits followed, their eyes locking onto Diddy with the same cold indifference as before. There was no shift in their demeanor, no sign of sip-a or leniency. They were here to collect his answer, not to negotiate. Diddy wiped a hand down his face, forcing himself to sit up straighter. His body felt weak, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. He had never been a man who begged, never been a man who folded. He had built his world on defiance, on standing above everyone else, on making sure that when the dust settled, he was the last one standing. But now he was sitting in a chair that didn't belong to him, staring at men who owned the room. The judge sat down, folding his hands in front of him, waiting for Diddy to speak. When he didn't, one of the men in suits leaned forward, slightly breaking the silence. You've had time to think. He said, what's your answer? Diddy's jaw clenched. They wanted to hear him fold. They wanted to hear him say the words that would seal his fate, not just in the courtroom, but in the world that had made him. He felt the anger rise in his chest. First, the fear came next, tangled with the weight of betrayal, with the knowledge that he had been left to rot by the same people who had once sworn loyalty to him. And then the crash. It all came down at once. His breath hitched, and then he snapped. He slammed his fist onto the table hard enough to rattle the file stacked neatly in front of the judge. This is a setup, he snarled. His voice, raw and strained, filled the room like a strike of thunder. You think I don't see what's happening? You think I don't know what this is? The men in suits didn't flinch. Diddy pushed back his chair, standing so abruptly that the U.S. Marshals outside the door stepped forward, hands resting on their belts. You want me to say it, don't you? His breathing was heavy now, his chest rising and falling as the weight of months, years, decades of control being ripped from him burned through his body. You want me to sit here and give you names? You want me to take the fall, to be your goddamn example? The judge exhaled slowly, not reacting to the outburst. Diddy's hands clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His heart was racing. He could feel the heat rising in his skin, could feel the rage threatening to consume him. He pointed a finger at the men in suits, his voice dropping lower, more venomous. "You think? I don't know how this works. You think I don't see what you're doing?" He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "This ain't about justice. This is about power." It always has been. One of the men in suits tilted his head slightly, watching him with the same unreadable expression. Diddy continued, "You're protecting the real players, the ones you won't name, the sitting in boardrooms while you put on this little show." His voice shook now, not with fear, but with the sheer weight of everything crashing down at once. "You want to talk about racketeering, about coercion? What the hell do you think this is?" He gestured toward the files, toward the room itself. "You don't want me to talk? You want me to fall in line?" He let out another laugh, sharp and humorless. "You really think I'm that stupid?" The judge remained silent for a long moment. Then, without shifting his posture, without raising his voice, he spoke the words that ended everything. "You have until your next hearing to decide." The room went still. Diddy's breathing was ragged, his fingers twitching at his sides. He was drowning in his own anger, in his own desperation. But the judge was unmoved. He took a step forward, but the U.S. Marshals flanking the door stepped in, instantly blocking his path. He could hear the leather of their belts creak, could see the tension in their stance. He wasn't a mogul in here. He wasn't untouchable. He was just another prisoner who had gotten too loud. The judge rose from his chair, straightening his tie with the kind of ease that told Diddy he had already decided how this story ended. "I'd choose carefully if I were you," he said. His voice was steady calm, "because if you say no, Mr. Combs." He let the paw stretch, making sure the words landed. Then he leaned forward slightly, his next words so quiet they barely carried across the room. "We will make sure you die in here." The finality in the judge's voice sent a chill down Diddy's spine. For the first time since this all started, the rage didn't surge forward. The defiance didn't kick in. For the first time, he felt it. The walls closing in the cold weight of certainty. The understanding that there was no escaping this. He had lost, and the men in the room with him, they already knew it. Chapter 8. Back to the cage, no more. Illusions. The ride back to NDC Brooklyn was silent. Diddy sat in the back of the transport van, wrists, cuffed ankles, shackled the cold steel of the bench beneath him digging into his skin. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the radio and the dull hum of the tires rolling over pavement. The two officers in the front didn't speak. To him, didn't even glance in his direction. They had transported hundreds of men just like him, men who had once believed they were different, that the system didn't apply to them, that they were too powerful, too connected, too important to ever end up in a place like this. But now Diddy was just another name on a roster, just another body moving through the machine. The heavy doors of MDC Brooklyn loomed as the van pulled into the secured entrance. The gates groaned as they slid open. The same routine, happening every day, every night, swallowing men who had once walked free and replacing them with inmates. The guards outside barely reacted to his return. No whispers, no smirks, no curiosity. They had seen it all before, but inside was different the moment. He stepped through the intake area. The energy changed. The inmates who had once watched him with quiet curiosity now stared openly. He didn't need to hear the whispers to know what they were saying. They had been waiting to see how he would return. Whether he would walk back through those doors like a man who still believed he had a way out, or like a man who finally realized the truth. He felt their eyes on him. Ash was led past the common areas down the hall toward his unit. His shoulders tensed under the weight of their attention, but he didn't acknowledge them. The arrogance he had carried when he first arrived gone. The confidence that had once made him untouchable shattered. He had seen it happen to other men before. He had seen powerful men reduced to nothing. Within these walls, he had told himself it would never be him. But it was him, and the inmates could see it. As he walked, he passed a few familiar faces. Some nodded, acknowledging him in the way one predator acknowledges another, but others just watched. Some of them smirked. Some whispered to each other. Some just waited because the truth was clear. Now he was no longer Diddy, the untouchable mogul, the industry legend, the man who had built an empire, higher. He was just another prisoner with nowhere to run. The cell door clanged, shut behind him, locking him into the small gray space that had become his world. The bed was stiff, the air thick with the scent of sweat and metal. The walls were covered in faint scratches, remnants of men who had lived in this cage before him. The cot creaked as he sat down, his hands still shaking. Though he tried to steady them that night, he didn't sleep. He couldn't. The words from the judge, from the men in suits, from the people he'd once called allies, played in his head on an endless loop. Life sentence, sealed indictments, footage, testimonies, betrayals he had spent decades making. Sure, there was nothing that could ever touch him, and it hadn't been enough. For the first time, he understood something he had refused to accept before. He was never getting out. Not in 5 years. Not in 10. Never. He could fight the charges. He could drag this case through every court in the country. He could pay the best lawyers. Money could buy. But it wouldn't change anything. They had too much, and worse than that, he had no idea how much. They really had. That was the part that aided him the most. The uncertainty he knew about the tapes, about the testimonies, about the people who had turned on him. But how? How deep did it go? What else had they been